It was terrifying to see the bomb cyclone burying the Carolinas under 12 inches of snow. 12 inches in regions that see dustings, if that. Blizzard warnings where blizzards don't exist. 35 million Americans under alerts. The news will show you totals, closures, chaos. What they won't show you is why this keeps happening. 3 weeks ago, the strongest solar storm in 23 years slammed into Earth. The polar vortex collapsed immediately. It still hasn't recovered. Recovery takes 2 weeks maximum. We're in week 4. And while the storm batters the southeast, something else is developing. Sunspot 4366, one of the fastest growing, most unstable regions of the entire solar cycle, is threatening to erupt within 48 hours. If it fires while the vortex is broken, February could make January look like a warm-up. The sun and the weather are connected. The institutions just won't say it. Stay until the end, because what you're about to hear will change how you see every storm from now on. If this makes you wonder what else isn't being connected, subscribe now, because the sun's rotation continues, and we'll be tracking what happens next. Leave a comment with your location, your current conditions, and whether you think we're being told the truth about why the weather keeps breaking its own rules. Let's start with what we know for certain. Palm trees stand next to snowdrifts in North Carolina this morning. The image doesn't compute. Your brain keeps trying to resolve it like a photograph taken on 2 different planets and then stitched together in post-production. But this is real. This is happening right now as you're listening to this. 12 inches of snow are burying regions that receive dustings every few years. If that, places where the concept of accumulation is almost theoretical. Blizzard warnings are active in areas that don't own snowplows. Cities without salt reserves, without winter protocols, without any institutional memory of how to handle this. The infrastructure doesn't exist because it was never needed until now. 35 million people are under emergency alerts. And if you turn on the news, you'll see reporters standing in the snow listing road closures, showing you footage of empty grocery store shelves, maybe a human interest story about neighbors helping neighbors. All of that is real. All of that matters. But none of it answers the actual question. The question isn't what is happening. The question is why this keeps happening. Let me be clear about something from the start. Storms don't decide to be historic on their own. Weather doesn't wake up one morning and choose chaos. The atmosphere is a system, and systems respond to inputs. If the output is unusual, it means the input changed. It means something upstream broke, and we're watching the consequences cascade downstream. What you're seeing in the Carolinas isn't an isolated event. It's a symptom. The atmosphere was already sick. The bomb cyclone is just the fever breaking through. Here's what the coverage won't tell you. This didn't start this weekend. This started weeks ago. The timeline matters more than anyone wants to admit. Because if you only look at the moment the snow starts falling, you miss the part where the system failed to reset. You miss the part where normal recovery didn't happen. You miss the reason why a bomb cyclone is even possible in a place where bomb cyclones shouldn't form. The atmosphere has memory, not in the way humans remember things, but in the way momentum carries forward. When a disruption happens, the system tries to correct. It oscillates back toward equilibrium. That's what should have happened. That's what always happens. Except this time, it didn't. The correction never came. The system is still lurching, still unbalanced, still spilling cold air into places it shouldn't reach. And that changes everything. You're going to hear a lot of words over the next few days. Record-breaking, unprecedented, historic. Those words are designed to make you feel something, but they don't explain anything. They're emotional labels slapped onto a phenomenon that nobody wants to contextualize, because contextualization requires admitting that the normal rules aren't working anymore. It requires asking uncomfortable questions about why this winter feels different, about why the atmosphere seems stuck, about why the patterns we relied on for forecasting are now just suggestions. The media will show you snow totals. They'll show you traffic cameras and canceled flights and school closures. They'll interview meteorologists who will tell you about the storm's intensity, about the pressure gradient, about the moisture dynamics. All accurate, all incomplete, because none of them will zoom out far enough to ask what preconditioned the atmosphere for this. None of them will ask why the ingredients were already in place. None of them will mention that the Arctic air currently flooding the southeast was supposed to be locked up near the pole, contained by a circulation pattern that collapsed 3 weeks ago and still hasn't come back. And here's the uncomfortable part, the part that doesn't fit into a weather segment. To understand why this bomb cyclone exists, you have to leave Earth for a moment. You have to look up, because the atmosphere doesn't just respond to oceans and jet streams and temperature gradients. gradients. It responds to energy, and energy doesn't only come from below. Part of it comes from 93 million miles away. You've heard the term polar vortex thrown around like it's a creature that occasionally escapes and wreaks havoc before getting dragged back north. The language is soft, controlled. The vortex weakens or stretches or becomes wavy. These are the words forecasters use because they sound manageable. They sound like variations on a theme, like the system is still fundamentally intact, just experiencing turbulence. But there's another word, a word you don't hear nearly as often: collapse. Collapse doesn't mean the same thing as weakening. Weakening implies a spectrum, a dial you can turn down and then turn back up. Collapse means structural failure. It means the mechanism that contains Arctic air near the poles stopped functioning, not partially, completely. The circulation that normally acts like a fence around the coldest air on Earth didn't just develop gaps, it fell apart. And when that happens, the cold doesn't leak out slowly, it pours. Let me give you a timeline because timing is everything here. 3 weeks ago, on a date that most people weren't paying attention to, Earth's magnetosphere was hit by one of the strongest solar storms in over 2 decades. I'll come back to that because it matters more than you think. But immediately after, within days, the polar vortex began to destabilize. Not drift, not wobble, destabilize. By mid-month, the containment structure was gone. Cold air that should have been circulating above the Arctic was spilling south into North America, Europe, Asia. The jet stream, which normally acts as a boundary, became porous. Here's where it gets strange. The typical recovery window for a disrupted polar vortex is 1 to 2 weeks. This isn't controversial. This is widely accepted in meteorology. The system corrects itself. The circulation reestablishes. The fence gets rebuilt, except we're now in week 4. 4 weeks, and the vortex still hasn't fully reformed. The cold air is still leaking. The jet stream is still erratic. The system is still broken. Persistence matters more than intensity. A single cold snap, even a severe one, is manageable. The infrastructure flexes. The models adjust. Life continues. But when the cold doesn't leave, when it keeps recycling, when every weather system that develops has access to Arctic air it shouldn't have access to, that's a different situation entirely. That's not a storm. That's a regime change. And this is where the bomb cyclone comes in. The bomb cyclone didn't form in isolation. It formed inside this failure state. The atmospheric setup that allowed a rapidly intensifying low-pressure system to develop over the southeast was already there, baked into the environment by weeks of unresolved vortex disruption. The temperature gradient between the Arctic air flooding south and the relatively warm Atlantic created fuel. The system didn't need much of a spark. It just needed the ingredients to align, and they did because the baseline had already shifted. You're going to hear meteorologists describe this as a favorable pattern for storm development. That's true, but incomplete. The question is why the pattern became favorable, why the Arctic air was available, why the containment failed, why it's still failing. The answer won't come from looking at weather maps alone. Weather maps show you the state of the system. They don't show you what forced the system into that state. For that, you need to ask a different question, a question that takes you out of the troposphere entirely. What broke the reset mechanism? What prevented the vortex from recovering the way it always does? Hold that thought because the answer starts 93 million miles away. 3 weeks ago. Most people remember that date because their phones lit up with alerts about GPS disruptions. Airlines rerouted flights, satellite operators braced for impacts. The news coverage focused on technology, on infrastructure, on the inconvenience of it all. What they didn't talk about, what they never talk about, is what happens to the atmosphere when Earth gets hit by a solar storm of that magnitude. Let me walk you through what actually occurred. The sun released a coronal mass ejection, a billion-ton cloud of magnetized plasma directly at Earth. It arrived fast, within hours, not days. When it collided with Earth's magnetosphere, the protective magnetic shield surrounding our planet, the impact was severe enough to rank among the strongest geomagnetic storms in over 20 years. The magnetosphere compressed. Earth's shield didn't fail, but it bent. And when it bent, particles got through. Protons, electrons, high-energy radiation, all of it funneling into the upper atmosphere, concentrated near the poles where the magnetic field lines converge. This isn't speculation. This is measured. Satellites detect it. Ground-based instruments record it. The energy deposition is real. The question is, what happens next? Where does that energy go? Here's what you won't see in the headlines. Energy doesn't just disappear, it has to go somewhere. And by the time the response becomes visible as weather, the original forcing event is forgotten. Nobody connects them. Nobody asks if the solar storm that disrupted GPS also disrupted the stratosphere. Except the timing is hard to ignore. The vortex disruption began immediately after the solar storm. Not weeks later, not months later. Immediately. Does that prove causation? No. Science doesn't work that way. Correlation is not proof, but correlation is a reason to look closer. It's a reason to ask whether the stratosphere, already delicate in winter, was destabilized by an influx of energy it wasn't supposed to receive. And here's the part that should concern you. Solar storms don't just deposit energy in the upper atmosphere and leave. And by the time the response becomes visible as weather, the original forcing event is forgotten. Nobody connects them. Nobody asks if the solar storm that disrupted GPS also disrupted the stratosphere. Except the timing is hard to ignore. The vortex disruption began immediately after the solar storm. Not weeks later, not months later. Immediately. Does that prove causation? No. Science doesn't work that way. Correlation is not proof, but correlation is a reason to look closer. It's a reason to ask whether the stratosphere, already delicate in winter, was destabilized by an influx of energy it wasn't supposed to receive. And here's the part that should concern you. Solar storms don't just deposit energy in the upper atmosphere and leave. The stratosphere is coupled to the troposphere below it. The layers talk to each other. They exchange momentum, temperature, circulation patterns. If you perturb the stratosphere, the troposphere responds, not instantly, but eventually. The lag time is typically 1 to 3 weeks. We're in week 4 now. The timing fits, the mechanism fits, the outcome fits. What doesn't fit is the public conversation. Because admitting that solar activity can influence weather patterns on timescales of weeks means admitting that weather isn't just an internal Earth system. It means admitting there are external forcings we don't fully understand, can't predict with certainty, and therefore can't neatly package into a 7-day forecast. The institutions won't say it. They'll talk about the storm. They'll talk about climate trends. They'll talk about jet stream variability, but they won't talk about the sun. Not in this context, not in a way that connects energy input to atmospheric response. Because the moment they do, the model gets complicated, the public gets confused, the neat narratives fall apart. But the atmosphere doesn't care about narratives, it responds to physics. And if the physics says energy entered the wrong layer at the wrong time, then the system responds. Which brings us to a question nobody wants to ask. If a solar storm can disrupt the polar vortex for weeks, what happens when the disruption occurs during the most vulnerable part of winter, when the vortex is already under stress, when the atmosphere is already primed for instability? They'll talk about climate trends. They'll talk about jet stream variability, but they won't talk about the sun. Not in this context, not in a way that connects energy input to atmospheric response. Because the moment they do, the model gets complicated, the public gets confused, the neat narratives fall apart. But the atmosphere doesn't care about narratives, it responds to physics. And if the physics says energy entered the wrong layer at the wrong time, then the system responds. Which brings us to a question nobody wants to ask. If a solar storm can disrupt the polar vortex for weeks, what happens when the disruption occurs during the most vulnerable part of winter, when the vortex is already under stress, when the atmosphere is already primed for instability? You get what we're seeing now. You get persistent cold. You get bomb cyclones forming where they shouldn't. You get this weekend storm. Let me explain what a bomb cyclone actually is, because the term gets thrown around like it's a measure of snow accumulation. It's not. A bomb cyclone is defined by pressure, not precipitation. Specifically, it's a mid-latitude storm whose central pressure drops at least 24 millibars in 24 hours. That's explosive intensification. That's why the term exists. The pressure collapses so fast, the system essentially detonates in the atmosphere. The fuel for this kind of rapid development is temperature gradient. You need a sharp contrast between air masses. Cold air colliding with warm air creates instability, and instability is the engine. The greater the gradient, the more violent the system can become. In the middle of winter, over the open ocean, where Arctic air meets Gulf Stream warmth, you expect this. Nor'easters do it routinely, but over the southeast, over land, in regions where the temperature differential is usually moderate, that's new. That's the broken baseline. Here's why it's happening now. Normally, the southeast in late January is coldish. Cool, maybe, not Arctic. The Gulf of Mexico provides a buffer of warmth, and the jet stream typically keeps the coldest air farther north. But when the polar vortex collapses, when Arctic air floods south with nothing to stop it, that buffer disappears. You suddenly have air masses that shouldn't coexist in the same region occupying the same space. And when a weather system tries to organize in that environment, it has access to fuel it was never supposed to have. The bomb cyclone didn't intensify because it was special. It intensified because the atmosphere was already loaded with potential energy. The gradient was already there. The cold air was already in place. The storm just had to organize, and once it did, the rapid pressure drop was almost inevitable. The models saw it coming because the thermodynamics were obvious. What the models didn't explain, what they can't explain, is why the setup existed in the first place. And here's where it gets unsettling. This is the second bomb cyclone to develop in the eastern United States during this disruption window. The first hit earlier this month. Same mechanism, same abnormal cold pool, same explosive development. 2 bombs in 3 weeks. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern. The atmosphere has momentum now. It's carrying the disruption forward. Every system that develops inherits the broken baseline. Every forecast has to account for conditions that weren't supposed to persist this long. There's a concept, not formal science, but a useful metaphor called atmospheric memory. The idea is that the atmosphere doesn't reset instantly after a perturbation. It carries information forward. A disrupted vortex doesn't just snap back. It oscillates, overcorrects, sometimes locks into a quasi-stable state that prolongs the anomaly. Think of it like aftershocks after an earthquake. The initial rupture is over, but the crust keeps adjusting, keeps slipping, keeps releasing energy. The atmosphere works similarly. The solar storm 3 weeks ago was the rupture. We're in the aftershock phase now, and the aftershocks aren't weakening, they're compounding. Each storm that develops reinforces the pattern. Each cold surge drains more Arctic air south. Each disruption makes it harder for the vortex to re-establish. It's not chaos, it's momentum. It's a system that was knocked off balance and hasn't found its footing again. But here's the thing that should keep you awake tonight. While all of this unfolds, while emergency managers scramble and forecasters update alerts and meteorologists analyze pressure maps, the sun isn't quiet. The sun is doing something that nobody on the evening news is going to mention because while everyone is watching the snowfall, the sun is preparing to erupt again. Cut from the radar loop showing the bomb cyclones spiral over the Carolinas to an image of the sun's surface. The contrast is jarring. One screen shows swirling clouds and snowfall. The other shows a seething ball of plasma with dark scars across its face. Those scars have names. One of them is Sunspot 4366. Sunspots are regions where the sun's magnetic field becomes so twisted, so concentrated, that it suppresses convection and creates a cooler patch on the surface. Cooler is relative. We're still talking thousands of degrees, but compared to the surrounding plasma, these regions appear dark. And when magnetic field lines get tangled enough, they can snap. When they snap, they release energy. A lot of energy in the form of solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Sunspot 4366 emerged rapidly. Over just a few days, it grew from nothing into one of the most intensely clustered, magnetically complex regions of the entire solar cycle. Solar physicists watch for this kind of emergence because rapid growth usually means instability. It's like watching a knot tighten. The faster it tightens, the more likely it is to break. And when sunspots this active break, the eruptions can be significant. Here's why this matters. Right now, this weekend, while the bomb cyclone is making headlines, Sunspot 4366 is Earth-facing. It's positioned almost directly toward us. If it erupts, if it releases a coronal mass ejection in our direction, Earth is in the firing line, and the probability of an eruption isn't zero. Solar forecasters are estimating a moderate to high chance of M-class flares, possibly even X-class within the next 48 hours. M-class flares are strong. X-class flares are the strongest category we have. Now, let me be clear. Solar flares happen all the time. The sun is active. This is solar maximum, the peak of the 11-year cycle, and activity is expected. But there's a difference between routine activity and a major eruption hitting a planet whose atmosphere is already destabilized. There's a difference between a solar storm arriving when the polar vortex is intact and one arriving when the vortex is still broken, still leaking, still unable to recover. If Sunspot 4366 fires a coronal mass ejection at Earth in the next 2 days, and if that CME is strong enough to cause another geomagnetic storm, we're looking at a secondary forcing event hitting a system that never recovered from the first one. The stratosphere already perturbed could be hit again. The vortex already disrupted could be prevented from reforming. The cold air already flooding south could persist even longer. And here's the timing issue that nobody's talking about. We're entering February. February is historically one of the most volatile months for late winter weather. The atmosphere is transitioning. The jet stream is shifting, blocking patterns can develop. And if all of that happens while the sun is throwing energy at Earth's magnetic shield, while the vortex is still collapsed, while the baseline is still broken, then February could make January look like a warm-up act. I need to emphasize something. I'm not claiming certainty here. Solar forecasting is probabilistic. Sunspots don't always erupt. Coronal mass ejections don't always hit Earth, even when they're released in our direction. The magnetosphere is resilient. It absorbs a lot before anything reaches the atmosphere. But the convergence of factors right now, the alignment of vulnerabilities, is unusual. It's worth paying attention to. It's worth asking questions about. The news won't ask those questions. They'll cover the snowstorm. They'll interview stranded travelers. They'll show you footage of plows working through the night. All of that is important. All of that is real, but none of it is the whole story, because the whole story requires admitting that weather isn't just weather. It requires admitting that the atmosphere is coupled to systems we barely monitor, let alone understand. It requires admitting that the sun and the weather are connected, and that connection doesn't care whether we acknowledge it or not. So, while the bomb cyclone dumps snow on the Carolinas, while millions of people lose power and roads close and emergency declarations get signed, the sun continues to churn. Sunspot 4366 continues to grow. The magnetic field continues to twist, and somewhere in the background, quietly, without headlines or alerts, the possibility of another solar storm ticks upward. Now I need to tell you about something that sounds like science fiction, but is documented, measured, and deeply strange. While the bomb cyclone batters the southeast and Sunspot 4366 threatens to erupt, there's another anomaly unfolding in the solar system, an interstellar object designated 3I Atlas. And it's doing something that has astronomers quietly concerned. Comets have tails. Everyone knows this. As a comet approaches the sun, solar radiation and the solar wind push gas and dust away from the nucleus, creating the characteristic tail that always points away from the sun. It's one of the most basic, predictable phenomena in astronomy, except 3I Atlas has developed what's called an anti-tail, a structure that appears to point toward the sun instead of away from it. Now, anti-tails are known. They're usually optical illusions caused by viewing geometry. When Earth crosses the plane of the comet's orbit, you're seeing the tail edge on, and perspective makes it look like it's pointing the wrong direction. It's a trick of the light, except the anti-tail of 3I Atlas is not behaving like an optical illusion. According to the latest measurements, this feature extends for a distance larger than the gap between the Earth and the Moon. Think about that. A trail of material or something else stretching out for over 400,000 kilometers. But size isn't the smoking gun. It's the movement. Comet tails are passive. They're dust and gas pushed by the solar wind and radiation pressure. They drift. They flow. They do not wobble. A new paper details a series of oscillations detected in the anti-tail just before the object reached its perihelion, its closest point to the sun. These weren't random fluctuations. They were rhythmic, precise, almost mechanical. Imagine a ship at sea. Its wake trails behind it. If the ship turns, the wake curves. If the ship corrects its course repeatedly, the wake wobbles. The data shows a frequency of oscillation that matches no known natural outgassing process. If this were a simple vent of gas, it would be chaotic, or it would rotate with the object. But 3I Atlas is not rotating in a way that explains this. The wobble is independent of the object's spin. Dr. Avi Loeb has just released a commentary on this, and his words are being shared across every encrypted channel in the scientific community. He points out that a wobble of this magnitude involving this much mass implies a transfer of momentum. In simple terms, something pushed back. If you are trying to stabilize a craft, or a rock if you want to stick to the official story, against the intense gravitational pull of the sun, you make adjustments. You fire thrusters, you shift weight, you create a wobble in your wake, and there is more. The density of this anti-tail is wrong. Spectroscopic analysis is coming back with readings that are baffling the models. We are seeing absorption lines that shouldn't be there. It is not just water, ice, and dust. There are heavy elements, complex signatures. Some are whispering that it looks less like a tail and more like an exhaust plume, a magnetic exhaust. We are looking at an object that is correcting its path, an object that is trailing a structure larger than the distance to the moon, an object that made its closest approach on December 19th. And the mainstream media, they talked about a beautiful celestial event. They told you to get your binoculars. They didn't tell you that the tail was vibrating. Why? Maybe because they don't know how to explain it. Or maybe because they do. We are seeing a pattern here. First, the silence about solar weather connections. Then the dimming and wobbling of an interstellar object. And now this, a controlled oscillation in a structure that defies physics. The closer we look, the less it looks like coincidence, and the more it looks like coordination. The atmosphere isn't a single thing. It's not one uniform layer of air sitting above the ground. It's stacked, layered. Each layer has different properties, different behaviors, different rules. The troposphere is where you live, where weather happens, where clouds form and rain falls and storms develop. Above that is the stratosphere, colder, thinner, home to the ozone layer, and above that, the mesosphere, the thermosphere, each progressively more distant, more alien, more disconnected from daily life. But disconnected doesn't mean irrelevant. The layers talk to each other. They exchange energy, momentum, circulation patterns. What happens in the stratosphere doesn't stay in the stratosphere. It propagates downward slowly over weeks, but inevitably. This is called stratosphere-troposphere coupling, and it's one of the most under-discussed mechanisms in atmospheric science, at least in public conversation. Here's why it matters for what's happening right now. The polar vortex exists primarily in the stratosphere. It's a circulation pattern driven by the temperature difference between the polar night and the sunlit mid-latitudes. During winter, the pole is dark, the air cools dramatically, and a strong westerly circulation develops around it. That circulation acts like a container. It keeps the coldest air locked up. But if something disrupts the stratosphere, if the temperature gradient weakens or the circulation breaks down, the vortex can collapse. And when it collapses in the stratosphere, the effects eventually migrate down into the troposphere. The lag time is the key variable. Stratospheric disruptions don't cause immediate weather changes. The atmosphere has inertia. It takes time for the altered circulation pattern to propagate downward to influence the jet stream to change the weather. Typical estimates range from 1 to 3 weeks, sometimes longer. Which means if you're looking at weather today and trying to explain it with yesterday's stratospheric data, you're looking in the wrong place. You need to look back weeks. You need to connect events that seem temporally separated. The solar storm was 3 weeks ago. The polar vortex began destabilizing immediately after. By mid-month, the tropospheric effects were visible. Cold air pouring south, jet stream contortions, the system trying to adjust to a stratosphere that was no longer providing stable steering. And now, weeks later, we're still seeing those effects. The lag time hasn't expired. The coupling is still active. The stratosphere is still telling the troposphere what to do. This is where short-term forecasting fails. Weather models are extraordinarily good at predicting what will happen in the next 3 to 7 days. They ingest current conditions, run physics equations forward in time, and produce remarkably accurate results. But they struggle with long lag effects. They struggle with stratospheric forcings because the models are initialized with tropospheric data, and if the forcing comes from above, from a layer that's not heavily weighted in the initialization, the models miss it. They see the symptom, but not the cause. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Polar amplification, the phenomenon where the Arctic warms faster than the rest of the planet, makes the stratosphere more sensitive to perturbations. Small forcings matter more near the poles. The temperature gradients are sharper. The circulation is more delicate. A solar storm that might barely register in mid-latitudes can have significant effects at high latitudes. The system is primed for disruption. It's sitting on a knife edge. But when you try to explain this in public, when you try to say that weather events weeks apart might be connected through stratospheric coupling, you run into a wall. Weather is chaotic, people say. Chaos theory tells us prediction breaks down. Long-range connections are spurious. And that's true to an extent. Weather is chaotic. But chaos doesn't mean randomness. Chaos means sensitivity to initial conditions. It means small forcings can have large effects. It means the system can tip from one state to another based on perturbations that seem insignificant at the time. The stratosphere provides those perturbations. It acts as a reservoir of potential influence, storing energy and releasing it downward over timescales that don't fit neatly into weather forecasts or news cycles. And when the public conversation ignores it, when forecasters focus only on tropospheric dynamics, the result is a kind of explanatory gap. We see the weather, we describe the weather, but we don't explain why the baseline shifted. We don't connect the dots between the solar storm and the vortex collapse, and the persistent cold and the bomb cyclones forming in places they shouldn't. The lag is the missing variable. The vertical coupling is the missing mechanism. And until we start including them in the narrative, we're just describing symptoms. Here's what we know for certain. The bomb cyclone is real. The snow is real. The 35 million people under alerts are real. The collapsed polar vortex is real. The solar storm 3 weeks ago was real. Sunspot 4366 is real and Earth-facing. The wobbling anti-tail of 3I Atlas is real and documented. All of these are facts, measured and verified. What we don't know is whether they're connected, whether the solar storm disrupted the vortex, whether the vortex collapse enabled the bomb cyclone, whether another solar storm would prolong the disruption, whether 3I Atlas is relevant to any of this, or just a cosmic coincidence happening in the same time window. Science demands rigor. It demands proof. It demands mechanisms that can be tested and verified. And right now, we don't have that level of proof for the connections I'm suggesting. What we have are correlations, timing coincidences, and a growing sense among those paying attention that something unusual is happening. But here's what I can tell you with certainty. The pattern we're in is not normal. 4 weeks of vortex disruption is not normal. Bomb cyclones in the Carolinas are not normal. The persistence of the cold, the repeated storms, the refusal of the system to reset, none of that is normal. And when multiple abnormal things happen in the same time window, you have two choices. You can dismiss it as coincidence, as natural variability on the extreme end of the distribution. Or you can ask whether there might be connections we're not seeing, mechanisms we're not accounting for, forcings we're not monitoring. The institutions will choose the first option. They'll say this is just a bad winter, that the vortex will eventually recover, that the storms are unfortunate but explainable, that there's no evidence linking solar activity to weather patterns on these timescales. And they're not wrong to be cautious. Science should be conservative. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but conservatism has a cost. When you're too conservative, when you dismiss every anomaly as noise, you risk missing genuine signals. You risk ignoring evidence that doesn't fit your models because your models don't have room for that evidence to exist. And in a rapidly changing climate, where the baseline is shifting and the rules are being rewritten, clinging too tightly to old frameworks can be dangerous. So what happens next? What happens if Sunspot 4366 erupts this weekend while the bomb cyclone is still active? What happens if another pulse of energy hits the stratosphere while it's still trying to recover from the first one? What happens if February brings more storms, more cold, more disruption, and the vortex never fully reforms? We don't know. We're in uncharted territory. The models weren't designed for this. The forecasters don't have historical analogs to reference. We're watching in real time as the atmosphere responds to forcings that may or may not be connected, that may or may not be significant, that may or may not represent a fundamental shift in how the system operates. What I can tell you is this: pay attention. Watch the sun. Watch the vortex. Watch the storms. And most importantly, watch for the connections that the official channels won't make. Because the truth is often found not in what's said, but in what's left unsaid. Not in the data that's highlighted, but in the data that's ignored. Not in the questions that are answered, but in the questions that are never asked. The bomb cyclone will pass. The snow will eventually melt. Life will return to some version of normal. But the pattern we've witnessed, the clustering of anomalies, the persistence of disruption, should serve as a wake-up call. The Earth system is complex, it's interconnected, and it's capable of surprising us in ways our models don't predict. The question is whether we'll learn from this experience, whether we'll invest in understanding these connections, whether we'll build the resilience needed to face an increasingly unstable climate, or whether we'll simply wait for the next disruption, the next storm, the next weekend when everything goes wrong at once and we're left scrambling to understand why. The choice is ours. The data is there. The questions are clear. Now we just need the courage to pursue the answers, wherever they lead. As I close this, I want you to understand something. This video isn't about fear. It's not about panic. It's about awareness. It's about asking questions that should be asked. It's about connecting dots that should be connected. It's about refusing to accept incomplete explanations when the evidence suggests there's more to the story. The bomb cyclone hitting the Carolinas this weekend is real and dangerous. If you're in the affected area, take it seriously, prepare, stay safe, follow official guidance, but also understand that this storm is part of a larger pattern, a pattern that started weeks ago with a solar storm, that continued with a vortex collapse, that persists because the normal corrective mechanisms haven't activated. And as this weekend unfolds, as the snow falls, and the wind howls, and the power flickers, remember that above the clouds, above the atmosphere, the sun continues to churn. Sunspot 4366 continues to grow, the magnetic field continues to twist, and the possibility of another eruption, another pulse of energy, another forcing event remains very real. We're 48 hours away from knowing whether the sun will fire again. We're days away from knowing whether the vortex will finally recover or remain broken. We're weeks away from knowing whether February will bring relief or escalation. The countdown continues, the pattern persists, and the questions remain unanswered. But at least now, you know what questions to ask. You know what to watch for. You know that the story you're being told is incomplete. The sun and the weather are connected. The institutions just won't say it. But the data speaks for itself. And if you're listening, if you're paying attention, if you're willing to see the patterns that others dismiss, then you're already ahead of the curve. Stay safe this weekend. Stay warm, stay informed, and most importantly, stay curious. Because the planet is speaking, the sun is speaking, the atmosphere is speaking, and it's time we started listening to what they're trying to tell us. The bomb cyclone is here, the vortex is broken, the sun is active, and February is just beginning. What happens next will determine whether this winter becomes a footnote in weather history or a turning point in how we understand the forces that shape our world. The countdown continues, and we'll be watching every step of the way.